Grace Cole was halfway through promising her husband another 10 years when his phone rang beside the ceremony microphone. The guests smiled at first. David glanced at the dark screen, rejected the call, and returned his attention to her. Grace continued reading, but the phone rang again before she reached the next line. This time the caller left David's face. For a moment, the soft laughter around them continued, unaware that the promise had already changed shape. He picked up the phone and turned slightly away. Grace stopped speaking. His thumb pressed hard against the case, the habit he used whenever he wanted to hide worry behind confidence. "David," she said quietly, "answer it properly." He hesitated, then lifted the phone near the microphone without remembering that the speakers were still live. He tried to smile, but the effort only made the fear behind his eyes easier to see. A frightened woman's voice filled the hall. "Come home, please, they are changing the locks." The floral platform, the music and the warm lights suddenly felt like scenery from another person's celebration. David lowered the phone, but it was too late. Every guest had heard the urgency, and every guest had heard the word home. Somewhere near the back, a glass touched a table with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud. The room became silent. Grace looked at the man she had just promised to trust again. "Who was that?" David avoided the question. He said someone was in trouble and that he needed to leave immediately. Grace asked which home the caller meant. His expression tightened. "I need to go," he said. Grace could feel the guests waiting for her to make the interruption look harmless. David stepped toward the platform stairs. Grace caught his wrist. "You do not walk away from me in the middle of our vows without telling me who called." He glanced at the guests. "This is not the place." Grace held his gaze. "You made it the place when you answered that call." Her fingers tightened around him, not from desperation, but from the need to stop another evasion. "She is in trouble," David said. "I will explain when I come back." Grace asked for a name. He gave her none. He pulled his wrist free carefully, as if a gentle movement could make the abandonment less public. Their hands separated, and something in Grace's face closed with them. The distance between them was still only a step, yet it already felt like another life. David walked through the center of the hall, while relatives and friends pretended not to stare. His dark suit grew smaller between the rows of chairs. Grace remained on the platform in her ivory dress, holding the unfinished vows. 3 months of counseling had led to this ceremony. One phone call had shown her how much of the marriage was still hidden. Nobody followed him, and that quiet permission made the humiliation feel even more complete. She folded the vow card once and handed it to the coordinator. "Tell everyone there has been a family emergency." Her voice was steady enough to protect the guests from embarrassment, but not steady enough to protect David. She lifted the hem of her dress, left the platform, and followed the path he had taken. She refused to let the broken ceremony become the only version of the night people remembered. Outside, David's black SUV pulled away from the venue. Grace watched until its lights disappeared. The caller had said, "Come home," yet David had not asked which home she meant. He already knew. Grace opened the vehicle tracking application linked to their insurance account and searched for the car they both owned. The cold air outside steadied her more effectively than any reassurance David had offered inside. David had disabled ordinary phone location, but the SUV signal remained active. It moved east, vanished briefly, then returned near a private estate. Grace ordered a ride. She did not call him again. For the first time that evening, she stopped asking for an explanation and began collecting facts. The moving point on the screen became the first honest answer she had received all evening. The ride crawled through Lagos evening traffic, while messages from the interrupted ceremony filled her phone. The driver glanced at her ivory dress. "Wedding?" he asked. Grace looked at the moving signal on the map. "Something like that." By the time they reached the estate, David's vehicle had stopped near the security gate. Each traffic light gave David more time to prepare a story and Grace more time to reject it. Two men in work clothes were carrying a metal lock and a clear box of tools toward the pedestrian entrance. David stood between them and the gate, arguing with two security officers. His jacket was open and his pocket square had shifted. Grace stepped from the ride before he noticed her. The workers looked tired rather than violent, as though they had been hired for an ordinary job. "Record my arrival," Grace told the older guard. David turned sharply. "Grace, go home." She looked at the gate, the workers and the husband who had left her before their guests. "I am his wife," she said. "Write that down too. I do not want anyone telling me later that I imagined this." David understood immediately that Grace was creating a record he would not be able to control later. The guard checked the visitor record and said David had been coming to the estate regularly. Grace asked how often. David reached for her arm, but she stepped away. Beyond the gate, his SUV stood outside an older cream-colored house. Warm light burned behind its windows, and packed boxes sat near the front steps. The guard answered carefully, but David's silence confirmed more than the visitor book could have done. Grace entered the house with David behind her. The sitting room was half-packed. Pale rectangles marked the walls where photographs had been removed. A tired woman stood near the front door and touched the wooden frame before closing it. She looked at David, then at Grace's ivory dress, as though both sights frightened her. Grace noticed that Sarah looked less like a rival than a person waiting for something to be taken. David spoke before either woman could ask the obvious question. "Grace, this is Sarah." He swallowed. "Sarah is my sister." Relief passed through Grace, but it did not last. A secret sister would have been strange enough. A sister hidden inside a second home was something else entirely. The relief lasted only long enough for Grace to understand how badly she had wanted a simpler betrayal. Sarah said she had lived in the house for almost 4 years. Grace turned to David. 4 years included birthdays, counseling sessions, and every conversation in which he had claimed his sister was staying with friends. A worker knocked and announced that the lock would be changed before the night ended. Sarah spoke as though every year in the house had required another small agreement with fear. David moved toward the hallway and told the workers they had no authority. Grace asked the question that mattered. "Who legally owns this house?" David said his uncle Peter had taken it from the family. Sarah stared at the packed boxes. "Peter cannot do this," David insisted, but certainty had already left his voice. The argument at the door made the legal question impossible to postpone with family emotion. Sarah produced a thin private lease from an envelope beneath the center table. Peter's name appeared as owner, and Sarah's permission to occupy the house could be ended with notice. "David promised to stop him," she said. Grace read the pages, then asked David exactly how he intended to do that. The lease was creased from repeated handling, suggesting Sarah had read it whenever the future felt uncertain. Grace searched the public case portal on her phone. An emergency property claim had been filed that afternoon, arguing that Peter's ownership arose from a dishonest transfer. David told her to close the page. Grace opened the final sheet instead. A professional certification sat beneath the claim, carrying the electronic form of her signature. David watched the phone as though the screen itself had turned against him. For several seconds, Grace could not breathe properly. The signature belonged to her law firm account. The language copied the structure of documents she had prepared for real clients. She turned the phone toward David. "I have never seen this document before." Sarah looked from the screen to her brother. Grace recognized the formatting because it imitated the disciplined work she had spent years learning to protect. David did not deny using the signature. He called it borrowing. Grace asked whether he had also borrowed her professional reputation, her password, and the risk of losing her license. "People listen when your name is attached," he said. "I used something they respect." Grace answered, "You committed fraud." The word borrowed revealed how completely David had mistaken access for ownership. A metal tool struck the outside of the door. Sarah flinched. David moved toward the workers, telling Grace he would deal with the lock first. Grace followed him into the hallway. "You protected your sister," she said, "without caring what the lie would do to your wife." Every blow against the door reminded Sarah that the family argument had already become physical procedure. David said he had run out of time. Grace looked at Sarah, the packed room, and the man still asking her to excuse what he had done. "You did not run out of time. You ran out of honest choices and decided my name was yours." She left the house before he could answer. Grace walked slowly enough to hear whether David followed, and he did not. By 8 the next morning, Grace sat across from Mark Reed, the firm's compliance officer. She placed the printed application on the glass meeting room table and reported the unauthorized signature. Mark wrote down the date before he spoke. He said her system access and active client files would be transferred while the investigation proceeded. Mark offered no comfort because protecting Grace required facts before loyalty. The access report showed a login to Grace's account from an unknown device outside the firm's registered equipment. The login occurred shortly before the application was submitted. Grace's stomach tightened. Mark turned the laptop toward her. "Do you recognize where you were that night?" The technical language was cold, but its meaning was intimate. Someone had entered her professional life from home. Grace remembered returning from counseling exhausted and leaving her laptop open on the apartment dining table. David had brought tea while she changed clothes. She had not seen him touch the computer. The memory proved opportunity, not guilt. Mark warned her not to confront anyone until the digital trail was preserved. In memory, the scene looked ordinary, which was precisely why the possibility frightened her. Grace agreed, then broke that agreement before noon. She found David beside his car in the underground parking area and blocked the driver's door. "Give me your phone." David looked toward the security camera and asked whether she planned to accuse him in public. Grace repeated the demand. Grace knew the confrontation was reckless, yet anger had made immediate certainty feel more valuable than evidence. David held the device close to his side. He said Peter would never negotiate with him and that Sarah would have been thrown into the street. Grace asked why that required her credentials. "Because your name makes people stop," he said. "I used something people respect." The admission hurt more than a denial would have. David spoke as though public respect were a family resource he had been entitled to spend. Grace told him the firm was tracing the device that entered her account. David's eyes shifted toward the phone. In the same instant, Grace understood her mistake. She had warned the person under investigation exactly what evidence the firm was seeking. "David, give me the phone," she said. The shift of his eyes lasted less than a second, but Grace saw the decision form. He turned and smashed the phone against a concrete pillar. The screen burst. Before Grace reached him, he tore the case apart and bent the exposed card. Then he entered the car and drove away, leaving her beside the broken pieces and the echo of Mark's warning. The fragments on the floor looked small compared with the damage the act confirmed. At the estate, Peter arrived with keys and a new lock. He treated David's withdrawn claim as proof that nothing could stop him. Sarah stood behind the gate with folded receipts in her hands. Peter gave her a final deadline and told Grace that, without the claim, the property matter was finished. Peter did not raise his voice. Ownership and procedure made him confident enough to speak quietly. Grace asked Sarah to confirm who prepared the filing. Sarah denied knowing anything. Fear made her voice flat. Grace could have threatened her with the consequences of lying, but she did not. "I will not force you to choose while you are afraid," she said. Sarah whispered that the family had hidden more than Grace understood. Sarah kept folding the paper until its edges became sharp beneath her fingers. Grace went to Helen Cole's apartment. Before Grace explained why she had come, Helen said, "David finally told you." The older woman sat at her round table, surrounded by family photographs and the quiet order of a life built from difficult compromises. Grace asked about the house. Helen did not ask whether the accusation was true, only how much Grace already knew. Helen opened a worn brown envelope from the cabinet. Inside was a signed sale agreement showing that she had legally transferred the house to Peter years earlier. Grace straightened the document edges before reading. "Did David know?" she asked. Helen pressed her palm against the table. The envelope had been preserved with the care of something both necessary and painful. The bank papers showed why Helen sold. Part of the money paid for Sarah's medical treatment, part cleared family debts. The final transfer went directly to David's university. The house had not vanished through one cruel transaction. It had been exchanged for several emergencies, and every person at the table had benefited differently. Grace followed each payment with her finger, watching family sacrifice become a traceable sequence. Helen said David knew where the education money came from. He had been present when Peter paid the final amount, and he had asked Helen not to change her mind. Grace looked at the agreement again. The house had not been stolen from David. It had been sold to build the future he was now using Grace's name to protect. The truth did not excuse Peter's cruelty, but it destroyed the history David had used to justify fraud. Grace stopped taking photographs of the copies. "I need the originals, and I need permission to verify everything." Helen handed her the envelope. Grace would not repeat David's mistake by treating family belief as legal proof. Copies were useful. Independent records were stronger. Grace understood that verification was also a way of refusing to inherit the family's habit of secrecy. The next morning, Grace met Mark at the property records office. Helen's agreement matched the registered transfer. The dates, witnesses, and ownership history were consistent. Peter had not forged his title. He had bought the property and recorded the purchase properly. The clerk treated the transfer as routine, which made the years of family mythology feel suddenly fragile. At the bank, Helen authorized release of the old transaction records. The education payment connected the sale directly to David. Mark said the evidence made David's theft claim almost impossible to defend. Grace answered that difficult was not the same as impossible, especially when grief could make people rewrite history. Mark closed his notebook only after every independent record pointed toward the same conclusion. David called while Grace and Mark stood outside the records office. He no longer claimed Peter forged the sale. Instead, he argued that Helen had no real choice, that Peter took advantage of illness and debt. Grace said a truthful argument could be made about pressure without inventing theft or stealing her signature. David's new argument contained real pain, but pain could not turn a false filing into an honest one. That afternoon, the family gathered in Helen's apartment. Grace placed the verified sale agreement on the round table. David stood opposite Peter. Sarah stayed near the window. Helen sat at the head of the table, the only person who had lived through every version of the story. No one chose a side immediately. The documents forced them to choose which facts they would accept. Helen said she signed willingly because she needed treatment for Sarah, relief from debt and university fees for David. David asked whether saving him had required giving Peter the family home. Peter answered that the property was his and that sympathy did not erase ownership. Helen's answer made clear that survival had never produced a clean or painless decision. Grace placed 3 groups of documents on the table. Ownership is one issue. Sarah's removal is another. The use of my signature is a third. She looked at David. You keep mixing them because the pain around the house makes the fraud sound necessary. It does not explain why you needed my name. For the first time, Grace controlled the room without borrowing authority from marriage or family loyalty. Silence settled over the room. David looked at Sarah. I needed it because Peter would never negotiate with me. So you made him believe I had prepared the claim. I knew he respected your firm. You knew he feared it. David did not answer. Sarah turned slowly toward him. You told me Grace agreed. David's face changed. I said she would understand. You said she approved the filing. I said what I needed to say so you would not panic. Sarah rose from her chair. You lied to both of us. David looked around the room as though someone might still defend him. Grace closed the sale file. Destroying your phone did not destroy the server record, she said. The login trail had survived. For the first time since the ceremony, David looked afraid rather than angry. David had expected the destroyed device to create doubt, not a trail that no longer depended on him. The following evening, Grace returned to the family house. Sarah was wrapping plates and placing them in boxes. What are you offering? She asked. Because truth does not give me another home. Grace said she could not promise the house, and she would not pretend otherwise. Sarah placed each wrapped plate carefully, as though order could make leaving less final. Grace sat near the boxes at Sarah's level. I can offer enough time to use the law properly. I can challenge the way Peter is trying to remove you. I can tell the truth about what David did. I will not use you to save my marriage. The anger in Sarah's face began to soften. Grace allowed the silence after her promise to remain, giving Sarah room to decide what honesty was worth. Among the folded receipts, they found a payment slip from the service used to submit the application. It did not prove every part of the fraud, but it connected David to the filing process. Sarah stared at it and admitted that David had shown her a receipt after saying Grace had approved the claim. The small receipt mattered because ordinary records often survived the stories people built around them. Sarah pressed the receipt flat. She described how David told her not to speak to Grace until the house was safe. I thought she knew, Sarah said. I thought she had chosen this with you. Then she looked at Grace. I will speak. Sarah's decision did not come from trusting the law completely. It came from refusing another lie. At the law firm that night, Mark completed the access audit. The login profile matched David's personal tablet and the home network. The filing receipt supported the timing. Sarah's statement supported intent. Grace no longer had one dramatic piece of evidence. She had several ordinary pieces that agreed with one another. Together, the records transformed suspicion into a sequence that another professional could independently follow. Grace arranged the material into two files. One addressed the unauthorized account access, false certification, and destruction of evidence. The other addressed Sarah's lease, Peter's defective notice, and the attempted lock change. For the first time since the phone rang, Grace understood exactly what she had to do. The two folders were not a compromise. They were proof that justice did not require one convenient story. The next morning, David waited outside the civil hearing room. When Grace approached with Mark and Sarah, he stepped into her path. Just say you approved the application, he whispered. The house stays protected, and we can solve everything else privately. David kept his voice low, knowing that a public demand would reveal the pressure hidden inside the request. Grace turned her wedding ring once. David reminded her that Sarah could lose her home because of what Grace said inside. Grace looked at Sarah, then at the closed hearing room door. You will hear my answer inside. She opened the door and walked past him. Grace stopped turning the ring when she understood that hesitation was the last private power he still held. Grace gave evidence that she did not prepare, review, or authorize the property application. Mark produced the access audit. Grace said a promise to help a family member was not permission to impersonate a lawyer or use another person's professional identity. Her answer cost her the marriage before any judge or investigator announced a consequence. Sarah testified next. She said David told her Grace had approved the filing and instructed her not to contact Grace. David's counsel challenged her fear and confusion, but the receipt and digital trail supported her account. The fraudulent property claim was suspended and referred for investigation. Sarah spoke slowly, separating what David had told her from what she now knew to be true. Peter relaxed too soon. Grace opened the second file and challenged the removal notice, the attempted lock change, and the failure to give Sarah the process required by her lease. The judge issued an interim order stopping the lock change and removal until the notice dispute could be heard properly. Peter's surprise came from discovering that lawful ownership did not permit every method of enforcement. In the corridor, Sarah faced David. She said she would leave the house if the law required it, but she would not let him fight in her name again. David insisted he had done everything for her. Sarah answered that protection without truth had become another form of control. Sarah's refusal was quiet, but it ended the role David had assigned himself in her life. Helen told David that the sale was her decision and the fraud was his. "What I did to keep this family alive belongs to me," she said. "What you did with Grace's name belongs to you." David's company suspended him from active projects while the authorities investigated the filing and destroyed evidence. The corridor left David surrounded by people he had claimed to protect and trusted by none of them. Sarah received time to find another home. When she finally left the family house, she carried one bag and one box. Grace waited near the path without pretending the outcome was a victory. Sarah touched the front door frame one last time, then walked away before anyone could remove her by force. The door frame held no legal power, yet touching it allowed Sarah to leave on her own terms. That evening, Grace returned to the apartment. David had removed his jacket and loosened his tie. She packed one overnight bag. "Do 12 years mean nothing?" he asked. Grace said they meant enough, that she would not rewrite them as a lie. David asked her to stay. Grace packed only what she needed for one night because she did not yet know what freedom would require. Grace removed her original wedding ring and placed it on the dining table. Then she removed the slimmer renewal ring and set it beside the first, without allowing them to touch. David asked, "Where will you go?" Grace lifted the bag. "Somewhere I do not have to lie to call it home." She closed the door behind her. Could you forgive a spouse who broke the law to protect their family? Or would using your name without permission end the marriage forever? The rings remained in the warm light after the door closed, two promises separated without becoming meaningless.